Hello everyone, today we are talking about percent proportions. We've talked about how to set up a proportion, how to solve a proportion. Today we're going to talk about proportions in the context of percentages. We are also going to talk about a very important life skill, which is using benchmark percentages to estimate things. So if you go to a restaurant or if you're tipping someone for a service, this is hopefully going to be a very helpful video. All right, so like we said, we're going to use percentages, our proportions to find percents. We're going to talk about benchmark percentages and how helpful they are when we're finding a number. Our most important benchmark fraction or percentage we are going to talk about is 10% of a number. So we can always find 10% of a number by dividing it by 10 or just moving that decimal one time to the left. Once we have 10% of a number, it's really easy to find 20%, 30%, or even cutting it in half to find 5%. So let's look at an example of that before we dive in. If I want to use or find 10% of 40, all I'm going to do is divide it by 10. So 40 divided by 10 gives us 4. The other thing you can do, especially if they're like money amounts, you could take that decimal and just move it one time to the left. So that 40 has a decimal afterwards, right? And so one time to the left gives us 4, which was the same thing we saw there. So 10% of 40 is 4. Now that we have 10%, I can easily find 5% or 20%. I know that 5%, right, is half of 10%, so half of 4 is 2. And I know that 20% is double that 10%, and so 4 times 2 is going to give us 8. So as soon as we find that 10%, it can be really easy to find other percentages as well. Let's practice that in action. Okay, so we're going to start off by just the 10%. So number one, finding 10% of 30. I'm going to take that 30 and I'm moving that decimal place back one time, so that is just 3. 7, moving it backwards 1, I get 0.7. 132, again, moving it backwards 1, I get 13.2. So when you're finding 10%, all you're doing is taking that decimal one time to the left. All right, now we're going to practice using that 10% to our advantage. So number 4, if we want to find 5% of 60, I'm always going to start with the 10% first. So 10%, moving it backwards 1 is 6. Now 5% is half of 10%. So I'm going to take that 6 and divide it by 2. So 6 divided by 2 gives me 3. So 5% of 60 would be 3. If I want to do the same thing but do 30%, again, always starting out with that base benchmark 10% by moving that decimal one time to the left. So 10% of 25 is 2.5. 30 is going to be 3 times that 10%. So I'm going to take 2.5 times 3 this time, which would give me 7.5. All right, I want you to pause the video here and try number 6 on your own using those same strategies. How did we do? All right, so we always, again, start with that 10%, move that decimal back one time. So 10% of 11 is 1.1. We're finding 80%, which is 8 times that. So 1.1 times 8 gives us 8.8. All right, the last thing we're going to do with these benchmarks is we're going to estimate. So if I want to estimate 22% of 50, I don't want the exact amount. I just want about how much 22% is. Well, I know that 22% is pretty darn close to 20%. So I'm going to use the same strategies we've been doing. 10% of that 50 is going to be 5. Moving that decimal back one time. 20% is double that. So 5 times 2 gives me 10. So not exactly, right? But if we're estimating that 22% of 50 is going to be right about 10. And if you actually calculate out 22% of 50, it's actually 11. So we can see that we were really close in our estimation. Okay, pause the video here and try number 8 on your own. So estimate 67% of 20. So not finding exactly, but estimate what would it be close to be. All right, test it out and see how you did. So we know that 67% is pretty close to 70. And so if I start with that 10% of 20, moving that backwards once, I get 2. We know that 70% is 7 times that 10%. So 2 times 7 gives us 14. And we actually do 67% of 20, we get 13.4. So again, we're pretty close in our estimation. Okay, here is where our proportions come into play. So we have something called the percent proportion, and this is how we can solve for percents using proportions that we've already been practicing. So the percent proportion looks like this. So it says part over whole equals percent over 100. So part over whole, percent over 100. A lot of times when we're looking at word problems, we use these words is and of a lot. So this is another helpful way to say it. Is over of is percent over 100, and that'll make more sense when we actually look at some problems together. So if I want to find 24% of 30, so that 100 is always going to be there. Now I need to know the percent is always going to be above 100. So 24% gives me that 24 over 100. All right, now I have this find 24% of 30. So of 30 means that 30 is my whole, and that's why that of is kind of there on the bottom. So I know that the 30 is going to go on the bottom, and that means that my missing number is going to be that top part up there. And so when I'm going through and cross multiplying that, I would get 7.2 as my answer. So I would say 7.2 is 24% of 30. Now, we love Desmos. We can always plug in, if they're asking for a percent of a number, we can always plug that in Desmos just like this. So when you guys type in that number, you always want to do the percent first. When you click on that percent button here, it's going to pop up as percent of. And so you'll see that it'll look just exactly like that word problem, 24% of 30, and your answer will pop up right there. So anytime they're asking for a percent of the number, definitely use that Desmos. It is a great tool to have. Okay, let's take a look at some examples. So what is 22% of 45? So we could definitely go and type this right in Desmos, 22% of 45, and get our answer, but I also want to show you that percent proportion. So setting it up, remember we have is over of equals percent over 100, or part over whole, percent over 100. So 100 is always in the bottom right, and our percent is always on top. So we got the 22 and the 100 taken care of. Of 45, remember, is over of. So of 45 means that 45 is the whole on the bottom, and x is going to be on top. Pause here and practice the proportion skills. All right, so looking for those two numbers diagonal from each other, multiplying them, dividing by our leftover number. 45 times 22 divided by 100 is 9.9, and that is the same answer you would get if you typed it into Desmos. Number 2, here is where we cannot use that Desmos trick, so we have to use that percent proportion. What percent of 25 is 12? So again, we have our 100 on the bottom. This time we don't know what the percent is, right? It's asking what percent, so that's actually going to be where our variable goes. Of 25, remember of goes on the bottom, is 12. So is that part on top. So we have that part over whole, percent over 100, and this time we're solving for the percent. So this time multiplying 12 times 100, dividing by that leftover 25, we get 48%. All right, number 3, 5 is 4% of what number? So again, not something we can just plug into Desmos. We're using that is over of, percent over 100. So I always put my 100 in the bottom right corner. I have 4% of what number is going to be where my variable is, because I don't know what number it is. And 5 is means that 5 goes on top. So pause again and solve this proportion. All right, and multiplying 5 times 100 divided by 4, we get 125. Pause the video one last time and try our last problem for this video. What is 105% of 40? Okay, so there were 2 ways you could have done this. You could type this one right in Desmos, 105% of 40, or using our percent proportion, is over of, percent over 100. We have that 105% over 100 of 40 means that 40 is on the bottom. When we cross multiply and solve, we get 42. All right, so that is how we use proportions to solve for percents, and we practiced using that benchmark percent of 10% to do some estimation. So hopefully you guys learned some good strategies. I hope you have a great day, and I will see you next time. Bye.